The reason this took so long and went through so many different iterations is that it's very difficult to talk about something that's defined by the fact it doesn't appear to physically exist. So the approach I ultimately took was to go through the item description text and look at individual sentences in the same way that I would point out physical objects within an area. So before I get going, there are 3 people I specifically want to thank. Firstly, as always, I want to thank Tower Walker over at Reddit, who did the Japanese to English translations that I'll be referring back to throughout this. I also want to thank Redgrave, because while I was writing this, I ran a few ideas by him, and he was not not very impressed by several of them. So that made me go back and either, I think, make a stronger argument for things, or just delete them entirely, because I realized they were ridiculous. And finally, I want to thank a YouTube user called Darkroot Mushroom, who I had a back-and-forth correspondence with for a while, and one of the topics we talked about was Oedon. And some of the ideas in here come out of that correspondence. So, let's begin with Oedon is linked to Caryll runes in a way that no other Great One, and arguably no other character besides Caryll, is. And he has 2 runes which are explicitly named after him. They're called the Oedon runes. So even though we have Caryll runes that are associated with certain characters, like the Eye is very heavily associated with Willem, and the Milkweed rune is associated with Adeline, they're not called Willem's Eye or Adeline's Milkweed. Yet these are called Oedon Writhe and Formless Oedon. So what is a Caryll rune? Well, we're told that Runesmith Caryll, student of Byrgenwerth, transcribed the inhuman utterings of the Great Ones into what are now called Caryll runes. And the description of every Caryll rune begins with a Caryll rune that transcribes inhuman sounds. So what Caryll runes are phonetic transcriptions of the Great Ones' voices. And this is something that the Japanese script is very overt about, because rather than referring to inhuman sounds, it explicitly refers to an inhuman voice. So already we've got a Great One who is described as existing only as a voice, being the only Great One who is explicitly mentioned in the names of Caryll runes, which are themselves transcriptions of a voice. And if you look at other runes and what they represent, they're all representing concepts like guidance and radiance and metamorphosis. But the Oedon runes are tied down to Oedon. It's not Formless and Writhe, it's Formless Oedon and Oedon Writhe. As if Oedon himself is just as important as the concept the rune is embodying. Also, the Oedon runes don't have any kind of backstory or explanation behind them. Most of the Caryll runes tell us where they came from or provide some kind of context for their use. So, Guidance is a Caryll rune discovered by the old hunter Ludwig. Hunter is adopted by those who have taken the Hunter of Hunters oath. Communion represents the Healing Church and its ministers. Radiance is adopted by the sworn executioners under Ligarius's command. But the Oedon runes don't tell us anything other than this symbolizes Oedon. So it's starting to look like, if Oedon exists only as a voice, then he's kind of like a Pokemon, and he's just saying his own name over and over and over again until it ends up inside people's heads as this Oedon rune. So this raises the question of, what is up with all these people that have Oedon runes in their minds? Most of the Caryll rune drops in the game tend to function narratively. So, for example, when you defeat Ludwig, he drops the Guidance rune. Now that's a rune that is very explicitly inside of Ludwig, he talks about it. Defeating Lawrence causes Lawrence to drop Beast's Embrace. which is a rune that we know Lawrence was kind of experimenting with, and possibly is what caused him to transform. And we're also told, for instance, that the impurity rune is found inside of Volta. So the concept of impurity was weighing very heavily on his mind. So, with that in mind, there are 4 characters in the game who will drop an Oedon rune if they're killed, which means that Oedon must have a presence of some kind in their head. So here's a rundown. We've got the Oedon Chapel Dweller, who drops level 3 Formless Oedon. We have Gascoigne's daughter, who drops level 1 Formless Oedon if you send her to Iosefka's clinic. We have Adella, who drops level 1 Oedon Writhe, and we have Imposter Iosefka, who drops level 2 Oedon Writhe if you kill her prior to the Blood Moon. And although it's not found on a person, we have the level 4 Formless Oedon on the top floor of Oedon Chapel. Now, of these characters, only the Chapel Dweller ever mentions the word Oedon, yet Oedon is inside the heads of all 4 of them. So, starting with the Chapel Dweller, he is the most straightforward case, because he spends all day in Oedon Chapel, which, as the name and the rune on the top floor suggest, is a place where Oedon is worshipped. Now, in order to make sense of how all these churches and chapels work in Bloodborne, you have to think of them in terms of being shrines, rather than churches. As I've kind of touched on a few times before, the religion that we're shown in Bloodborne looks Catholic, but it works like Shinto. Shinto as a belief system is animistic, in that it sees things in the material world as all having their own soul or spirit, which is called a kami. And basically anything can be a kami and have a shrine of some sort dedicated to it. So you have, for instance, you have shrines to the kami of a waterfall, you have shrines to the kami of a certain mountain, and there are shrines to historical figures who are venerated as kami. And in these shrines you have some kind of physical object that the kami is either seen to inhabit, or the kami is seen to be drawn to it. Common things would be statues, mirrors, scrolls, things like that. And you can see the Healing Church's Grand Cathedral is basically set up like one of these shrines. It's not set up like a Catholic cathedral. You have Amelia on her own worshipping Lawrence's skull, because he is an important figure in the history of the Healing Church. So even though there is this talk of communion and a cathedral and a vicar, it's not functioning anything like Catholicism, it's functioning like a shrine to the old blood. And this is why, even though Lawrence and Amelia are both the heads of the organisation, they're only ever referred to as vicars, rather than a more grandiose title, because they're really only concerned with their little self-contained blood shrine and the kind of parish around it. So with that in mind, you can look at Oedon Chapel and see that it's actually kind of structured in a similar way. It's a shrine to Oedon, who is seen as a kami. And at the very top, we find the second strongest of the formless Oedon runes. So this is probably the sacred object that Oedon would be drawn to or inhabit. I'm not sure whether we literally find the rune, or we find some object up here that imprints the rune on us. But whatever it is, it's clearly very significant to Oedon. So this would be fulfilling the role that Lawrence's skull fulfills in the Grand Cathedral. So this chapel is functioning as a kind of locus for Oedon's presence. And as a result, the Chapel Dweller has ended up with Oedon imprinted on his mind. Then we've got Gascoigne's daughter, who, even if we send her to Oedon Chapel, won't ever make it there. So initially it's not really clear how she's ended up with the Oedon rune in her mind. However, her family is tied to Oedon. We fight Gascoigne in the Tomb of Oedon, and he drops the Oedon tomb key. We also find the body of Viola, the mother of Gascoigne's daughter, in the Tomb of Oedon. Tomb of Oedon is also where Henrik shows up later on in the game. Henrik is very explicitly Gascoigne's hunting partner, and there's an implication that he might also be Viola's father, making him the grandfather of Gascoigne's daughter. And the reason that he goes to the Tomb of Oedon is presumably to meet Gascoigne. So all the stuff around Gascoigne's family kind of converges in the Oedon area as if it's significant to them. So the link between the Oedon area and Gascoigne's daughter isn't really that tenuous, because her mother, father, and presumably grandfather are connected to this area. So with that in mind, there's an infinite number of ways that the rune could have gotten into Gascoigne's daughter. The simplest answer would just be that she came here at some point with the rest of her family, which I think is reasonable. You could argue something more elaborate, though, like perhaps Viola came here while she was pregnant, and the Oedon rune has ended up inside the fetus. It could really be anything. The point is she is within, 2 degrees of this place. As to why Gascoigne doesn't drop the rune, well, Impostor Yosefka doesn't always drop her Oedon rune, and Gascoigne's daughter won't drop the rune if she's killed by the pig. So certain things can override the rune drops. It could even be as simple as something like Gascoigne being a beast at the time. And Oedon having some presence in or around the physical chapel would also explain why there's an amygdala hanging from the side of the building, as it's the only one that we see outside of Yahar'gul. So it must have a good reason to be here, and the presence of a Great One seems like a good reason. So far it looks like the formless Oedon rune is connected to the chapel. Then we move on to Oedon Rive, which seems to function very differently. The weakest version of Oedon Rive is dropped by Adella. Now you can send Adella to Oedon Chapel, but the thing is she will drop Oedon Rive regardless of where she dies, which can also be Yahar'gul or Yosefka's clinic. So it seems like she has Oedon Rive in her head whether she goes to Oedon Chapel or not. You can kind of infer she was in the area, though, if you stretch things, because she does say,
"I was seized on the street by a hulking brute in the cathedral ward."
And there is a snatcher right next to Oedon Chapel, which is in Cathedral Ward. So if this is the snatcher that grabbed Adella, she could have been in the Oedon Chapel area. Then we have the stronger version of Oedon Rive, which is dropped by Impostor Yosefka if you kill her prior to the Blood Moon. Now, Impostor Yosefka can never be sent to Oedon Chapel. In fact, she's nowhere near Oedon Chapel, and she never moves. You can extrapolate, though, that if she's part of the choir, then she's going to have come from Upper Cathedral Ward, which means she'd have to have come through the Oedon Chapel elevator. But I think that's something that we'll have to chalk up to game design and just assume there are other ways to get to Upper Cathedral Ward, like this gate here. Because otherwise you'd have these awkward elevator moments all the time. So here we have 4 people with Oedon runes in their minds. So I would say that these 4 characters are the inadvertent worshippers of Oedon. He is in their minds, and they don't seem to be aware of it. The exception being the chapel dweller, who openly talks about,
"This here Oedon Chapel."
So he's who I want to look at next. If we look at the item description of the Oedon Tomb Key, it tells us, "Today the church is abandoned, and some say that the residents of Oedon have all gone mad." Now, I had assumed that the residents of Oedon referred to people who lived around Oedon Chapel, like Oedon was some kind of suburb of Yharnam. But the Japanese is a lot clearer, because while the key still references the residents of Oedon, the name that the chapel dweller's given is Resident of Oedon. So when the key tells us that the residents of Oedon have gone mad, it's explicitly referring to the chapel dweller. Now, the immediate reaction to this, including my own immediate reaction, is that's clearly not right, because this guy is the nicest and most helpful NPC in the entire game, and one of about, I think, 3 who aren't secretly horrible people. Ergo, he cannot be mad. But that's down to us assuming that mad means malicious. That's not true, and the game underlines that itself in the research hall, because it's an area where we have patients who are clearly mad, but also have completely benevolent intentions and aren't trying to hurt you. So just because the chapel dweller is a nice guy who isn't trying to hurt you, doesn't rule out that he's also not in some way delusional. Another thing I'd like to point out is that just because he knows the place is called
the Oedon Chapel
doesn't mean that he's also aware that Oedon is a great one. The entire city of Yharnam takes its name from the Pthumerian language. It's not named after Yharnam herself, it's that the name Yharnam is, according to the Thumero-Ihil root chalice, a name with classical roots. And it's safe to say that the average resident of Yharnam doesn't know where the name came from, or what a Pthumerian even is. And we have other characters in the game, specifically German and Eileen, talk about Oedon Chapel quite casually.
Ascend to Oedon Chapel.
I must warn you not to go near the tomb below Oedon Chapel in the Cathedral Ward.
As if it's just the name of that place. So, put like that, the chapel dweller doesn't need to be consciously aware of the fact he is venerating a Great One in this chapel, particularly as nobody really knows anything about the Great Ones, including the people who do know about the Great Ones. All the chapel dweller has to know is that this is a chapel dedicated to something called Oedon, and that he wants to bring people here because he believes they'll be safe, which is, again, entirely possible even if he is mad. Another thing to note about the chapel is that everyone who is sent there will eventually go mad if they don't die first, and this is accompanied by a change in their personality. The chapel dweller is the exception. He doesn't change his behaviour. So either somehow he manages to stay sane when no one else can, or he's already mad. So him going mad under the blood moon would be redundant. Now, one thing that I've mentioned previously is that Japanese as a language doesn't always specify whether a noun is singular or plural. However, the reference on the key to residents of Oedon is actually specific. It uses the word minna, which specifies that there is more than one Oedon resident. A more literal translation would be something like all of the residents of Oedon. So we are missing at least one Oedon resident. Which brings us to this very, very strange room, which is clearly some kind of study. And here we find a note that says, "The Byrgenwerth spider hides all manner of rituals and keeps our lost master from us." Now, the Byrgenwerth spider is clearly wrong. As to who the lost masters are, we should just look at what happens when you defeat Rom, which is, the blood moon descends and we get the message, "Ritual's secret broken." And this leads to, basically, the Great Ones descending. So, the Lost Master, which could also be Lost Masters, thanks to the plural issues I brought up before, likely refers to either the Great Ones in general or to one specific Great One, possibly Oedon himself. So whoever wrote this note must be very, very knowledgeable, because outside the choir, Mensis, and Byrgenwerth, nobody knows anything about the Great Ones, or the ritual, or indeed the Byrgenwerth spider. So this message must have been left by someone who's got very intimate knowledge about the Healing Church. And I don't think it was the chapel dweller, since he's very explicitly referred to as
the blind man. They're the beggar sits at the bottom of the bloody food chain.
So, since this study exists in between the Tomb of Oedon and Oedon Chapel, whoever studied here should really be considered a resident of Oedon, which means they would have gone mad, and I think that's kind of played up in the final line of the note, which says, "It makes my head shudder uncontrollably," which sounds like the beginnings of madness. So we're looking for another Oedon resident who would have worked and studied here and has some connection to the Healing Church. And I think it's probably someone from the choir, because the choir are the part of the Healing Church who are obsessed with Byrgenwerth and obsessed with Rom. You find Yuri, a choir scholar, in Byrgenwerth. Imposter Yosefka seems to have gone there to grab the third chord she's using, and the surrounding woods area appears to be being used as a dumping ground for Celestials. It's also not entirely clear whether Rom is helping or hindering Mensis, because there's all these references to hiding the ritual and ritual secrets, which seems to refer to the Mensis ritual, in which case Mensis seem to be using Rom as cover for what they're doing. Although again, it's really not made clear whether us killing Rom is what allows the Mensis ritual to proceed, or whether the ritual would have gone ahead without us and it's just fortuitous that we happened to kill Rom at the right time. But basically, if anyone is going to be worried about Rom hiding stuff from them, it's the choir. And also, just in terms of geography, Oedon Chapel is in Cathedral Ward, which is roughly where the choir are based, whereas Mensis are hidden away in Yahar'gul, which is nowhere near here. So the study probably belongs to someone from the choir. Now, it doesn't need to be anyone that we're familiar with, because we only meet 3 members of the choir during the game. But hey, maybe it was one of them, so let's just quickly go through them and see who it could be. There's Yuri, Edgar the dashing secret agent, and imposter Yosefka. Now, I think at this point it's safe to say it's probably not Edgar, because he's busy infiltrating Mensis. It could very easily be Yuri, because when we meet her she's at Byrgenwerth, where the Byrgenwerth spider is located. It could also be imposter Yosefka, because she does have an Oedon rune in her head. So if she'd spent time in the chapel, that might explain why it's there. Also, the trigger for imposter Yosefka infiltrating the original Yosefka's clinic and taking over is us entering Oedon Chapel. So it could be that once she hears us coming, she leaves in a hurry, and that's why she relocates to the clinic. So, regardless of who, someone from the choir appears to be a semi-permanent resident in Oedon Chapel. So, just to recap where we are. We've got Oedon existing as essentially a disembodied voice in your brain that seems to be localized around this chapel. Oedon is manifesting in the mind of this guy here, who has lost his mind. Oedon is also manifesting in the mind of a small girl, whose family is connected to this area. Oedon also shows up in the minds of a blood saint of the Healing Church and a member of the choir, whose links to the area are tenuous, but not implausible. And then we have this note, left by a member of the choir who was stationed in Oedon Chapel and appears to have gone crazy. So this raises the question of what Oedon wants. And what he wants seems to be blood. Everyone in Bloodborne is obsessed with blood, to the point where Yharnam effectively has a blood economy. So the idea that blood is valuable and people are seeking blood doesn't really tell you anything on its own. To me, the important part of this description is that it specifies Oedon uses blood as a medium whether the blood is human or not. Because the only characters who drop Oedon runes are human, or at least start off as human before they're experimented on. So Oedon runes don't actually seem to be linked with having inhuman blood. So let's look at what the game considers to be not human. Lots of things in Bloodborne are described as not human. Things like kin-cold blood, the Great Ones, the Beasts, the Madara's twin snake, things like that. So I'm not going to go through all of them. There are two that I think are very important in order to understand Oedon. Those are the Vile Bloods and the Pthumerians. The Vile Bloods are an inhuman bloodline in English and an inhuman bloodline in Japanese. And the Pthumerians are superhuman in English and simply inhuman in Japanese. Now, in my video on Cainhurst, one of the things I kind of skirted around but didn't really develop was that Annalise is either Pthumerian or a human who has so much Pthumerian blood that she's effectively transformed into one. And something that's less controversial and basically taken for granted is that Arianna's blood is from Cainhurst. Her blood has unique properties. It's described as being similar to what was once forbidden, and if you take too much of it, Adella will murder Arianna and then attempt to murder you. So we have a bloodline that goes Pthumerian blood, Cainhurst blood, Arianna's blood. And the important thing is, each one of those generations is represented by a woman who is linked to childbirth. Yharnam and Annalise are both linked via their servants to the rune Blood Rapture, which reads, "This rune resonates with servants of the Queen, carrier of the Child of Blood." Now, Yharnam, when defeated, drops the Yharnam Stone, which looks a lot like it's a fetus that's developing out of blood. And she's also explicitly the mother to Murgo. Annalise, meanwhile, is explicitly trying to conceive a child using blood, which is why she has her servants bring her blood dregs. And there's also a patched out item description that explicitly refers to the cord we find in the abandoned workshop coming from the child of the Vile Bloods, which might have been Annalise's child. Arianna isn't consciously trying to conceive, but she does so anyway if she's sent to Oedon Chapel. Now, there's no indication that Arianna's pregnant when she first arrives. She doesn't look pregnant, and she only starts showing symptoms of pregnancy when the red moon appears. And after that, she proceeds to go through the entire pregnancy, from conception to birth, in the time it takes us to defeat Micolash. So this is clearly not a normal pregnancy in any sense. If Arianna's child dies, it drops a cord with this description. Every Great One loses its child and then yearns for a surrogate, and Oedon, the formless Great One, is no different. To think it was corrupted blood that began this eldritch liaison. Now, this cord explicitly says that Oedon's looking for a child. The child's born in Oedon Chapel, which, as I've covered, seems to be a kind of locus for Oedon. I think it's pretty clear Oedon is the father of this child. Furthermore, when the cord talks about corrupted blood, the Japanese description refers to Kegareta Chi. Now, if you remember the Cainhurst video, I talked a lot about the term Kegare, which is basically a way of saying this is filthy on a physical and spiritual level. So Arianna's blood is Kegare blood. That's what marks her out as unique, and that's what's allowed her to conceive this child. Oedon's conception only works if the blood is Kegare. Now, quick detour to Upper Cathedral Ward where the choir are based. It's absolutely crawling with these little celestial children like the kind Arianna gives birth to, but they don't drop third chords, which suggests that for some reason these aren't proper infant Great Ones. So the choir, despite having their own pet Great One locked up under the cathedral, can't produce proper infant Great Ones. Yet a human woman with sufficiently Kegare blood can. which makes the whole child of blood thing suddenly start getting really significant. Because it looks like, to Oedon, what's important isn't what species you are, it's the kind of blood you have. And the more Kagare, the better. It's also probably not a coincidence that Blood Rapture, the rune that talks about the child of blood, and Oedon Rive are mechanically a matched pair. They both involve the hunter essentially invading the body of the target, with Blood Rapture pulling blood out and Oedon Rive pulling mercury out. So with all this in mind, let's go back to our 4 inadvertent Oedon worshippers and divide them up based on the rune they carry. The Chapel Dweller and Gascoigne's daughter both have Formless Oedon, and then you've got Adella and Imposter Yosefka with Oedon Rive. Now, you could divide these up in any number of ways, but what I think is the significant one is that Imposter Yosefka and Adella are both capable of bearing children, like Ariana is. The Chapel Dweller is male, and Gascoigne's daughter is prepubescent, but Adella and Imposter Yosefka are both female and look to be in their 20s or 30s, so they are potential mothers for Oedon's offspring. And they're the ones with Oedon Rive, the rune that specifically exists to extract things out of blood. So, it looks like what's happening is, Oedon is concentrated as a presence around Oedon Chapel. He exists as a voice which renders itself in your mind as a Caryll rune. Oedon is looking for a mother for his child. In the case of the Chapel Dweller and Gascoigne's daughter, they can't conceive children, so Oedon just pops into their head as Formless Oedon. Adella and Imposter Yosefka would be useful, but they don't have the right kind of blood. So Oedon's influence manifests itself as Oedon Rive, which seems to be Oedon wiggling around inside the blood trying to find impurities. Ariana's blood, meanwhile, is so impure that rather than getting a rune, Oedon just has her conceive the child. So we kind of have a what and a why, but not a how, which is what I want to look at next. So we're back again to some extremely ambiguous wording. I don't know how you surreptitiously seek blood, particularly if you don't apparently know you're doing it. And the Japanese doesn't help because it essentially says the same thing. Basically, Oedon's unaware worshippers hunt for the blood without others knowing. So we'll go back to our 4 worshippers and cross out Gascoigne's daughter and Imposter Yosefka, since neither of them make it to the chapel, which is where Oedon is. This leaves us with the Chapel Dweller and Adella. So the Chapel Dweller, as I argued, can still have everyone's best interests at heart and be mad. Because look at what he is actually trying to do. His whole purpose in the game is just to get everyone who is still alive to come to Oedon Chapel. This is why Ariana goes there, and ultimately how Oedon is able to conceive this child. So if it weren't for the Chapel Dweller begging you to send people to Oedon Chapel, Oedon would not have been able to conceive a child. And remember, Oedon is just a voice. This guy has a Caryll rune in his head that says Oedon, and the Caryll rune is explicitly a transcription of a voice. So Oedon is apparently in this guy's head, and he is called mad. So the madness, the influence of Oedon's voice in his mind, could be manifesting as this extreme desire to help people, because that will lead them to the church where Oedon's presence is strongest. And when they're there, Oedon can check out their blood and see if they're suitable vessels for his child. The problem with assigning too much direct agency to Oedon in this situation, though, is Adella, who is also carrying an Oedon rune, and can actually end up killing Ariana, which prevents Oedon from conceiving. So if Oedon is exercising any kind of control, it would have to be an extremely subtle kind that can easily be overwhelmed. But let's look at what happens when Adella kills Ariana. It's something a lot of people don't experience because it has to be deliberately triggered and you don't really get anything out of it. Now, the accepted reasoning behind what Adella does is that because she's a blood saint of the Healing Church, and the Healing Church are opposed to Cainhurst blood and want it gone, she kills Ariana. But let's look at how she actually behaves. She very secretly kills Ariana. No one sees her do it. It's actually up to the player to put two and two together to figure out that Adella's done this, because Adella is making a point of hiding it. And when she tries to kill the player, she does so by hiding behind a corner and ambushing you. And when she's doing it, she says this.
I can't help myself.
So it doesn't seem really like Adella is doing this because she's a religious fanatic. She comes across more like she's possessed or had some kind of breakdown. If you contrast it with Alfred, it's very, very different. Alfred clearly is a fanatic who's killing Annalise for dogmatic reasons. He's unbalanced in the throne room because basically he's completely euphoric at having finally achieved Ligarius's goal of destroying Annalise. He's not blood drunk or possessed or anything like that. You can converse with him, and he won't attack you unless you attack him first. Now, he's a horrible, murdering psychopath, but this is still a rational decision that he's made. Whereas Adella does not seem to be in control of her actions. And also, this is not caused by the blood moon. The blood moon is present in this footage, but you can trigger this to happen at any point after you beat Amelia. So this is not the influence of the blood moon. So, in the most technical sense, by gutting Ariana because of her blood and then trying to hide it, then ambushing the player and trying to kill them unawares, Adella is, very, very technically, surreptitiously seeking precious blood. And even if you don't accept that, which is, fine, Adella's behaviour is clearly madness. So she could possibly be a resident of Oedon who has gone mad. So, to wrap up, what is it about corrupted blood that is so special to Oedon? You'll notice we're now in the astral clock, which has Oedon's 2 runes on the face. There's been some discussion about how exactly to read the clock and whether there's a message here, and that maybe it's symbolic of some sort of cycle where the events of the game have all happened before, etc., etc. I'm not going to touch on that right now, but there is clearly some kind of logic to the placement of the runes if you read them clockwise. And you should be reading them clockwise, because the dial is designed to be read from inside the clock, and that's the direction that it turns. So, the runes from the 6 o'clock position up to about the 9 o'clock position go like this. Sea, Lake, Impurity, Oedon Writhe, Formless Oedon. Now, what's initially confusing about this is that we've got 2 pairs of runes. We've got 2 water runes and 2 Oedon runes. But in between, we have this Impurity rune just sitting there and kind of disrupting the sequence. Now, 2 things about the Impurity rune. Firstly, the one on the clock face is slightly different to the impurity rune that we get from Volta. But for now, we'll act like they're the same rune and assume that there were crossed lines in the design department, someone didn't get a memo, or something like that. Secondly, in Japanese, the rune is not called impurity, it's called stagnation. The concepts of impurity and stagnation are linked in Shinto. So it's actually a pretty good translation because calling it stagnation wouldn't have the same nuance here that it does in Japan. But what it misses is that makes stagnation a water rune. So if you read the clock sequentially, you have a 3-rune sequence depicting the different states of water. You have a deep sea with powerful currents, and then you have a rippling lake where the water is still flowing but it's beginning to slow, and then finally you have water that has stopped moving and become stagnant. Out of the stagnancy comes Oedon Writhe, and Writhe is what vermin do. Now look at formless Oedon and impurity side by side. They're basically the same rune. So Oedon is linked with this stagnation. He's what happens when things stop flowing. Now, flow is an extremely important concept in Shinto. Everything is always in flow, and water in particular, streams, rivers, waterfalls that flow are seen as extremely pure, not because they're water, but because they're flowing. By always flowing and always changing, this water doesn't collect impurities. Whereas water that's stagnant, water that has stopped flowing, begins to collect impure things inside of it because they're not being washed away. And this is why you have this implicit connection in the game between impurity, stagnation, and writhing things. Because writhing creatures like mosquitoes and water beetles and things like that are born in stagnant water. And in the case of the impurity rune and the vermin, you have them growing in stagnant blood. So Yharnam blood is corrupt not because it's inhuman, but because it's stagnant, which makes it a kind of diet Kigare blood, which is almost, but not quite, what Oedon is looking for. Now, if you haven't watched Redgrave's video on Oedon yet, you should. Just in general, because it's good, but also because he talks a lot about mercury poisoning, and the significance of mercury poisoning in Japanese culture. And one specific thing I want to pick up on, which is one of many, many things he brings up, it's extremely well researched, is the concept of biomagnification. The way that you get mercury poisoning is that at the very bottom of the food chain, there's a lot of very, very small amounts of mercury. And as the animals containing those small amounts of mercury are eaten, the mercury starts to move up the food chain. So the higher up in the food chain an organism is, the more mercury has collected inside it. So the mercury isn't flowing, it's just collecting. And when it hits a certain point, you get mercury poisoning. So to me, the connection between Oedon and mercury isn't necessarily that Oedon is mercury or that Oedon's got any special connection to mercury per se. It's that mercury is an impurity and it's stagnating in the blood. And Oedon just really, really likes stagnation, because that leads to corruption, which is what he needs to conceive his child. Like it says, Oedon wants corrupted blood. That's the catalyst. He doesn't want mercury. If he wanted mercury, it would say that the catalyst was mercury. The person whose blood is of most use to him, Ariana, we have no indication that she's got mercury in her blood at all, particularly when you compare her to someone like Imposter Yosefka or Adella. Imposter Yosefka's part of the choir. She's probably dripping with mercury at this point. Adella's blood I'm less sure about, but again, the Healing Church don't seem shy about using mercury. They've been using it as a weapon before the choir were even formed. Ariana is a prostitute who appears to work out of her home in a dead-end street in Cathedral Ward. She's not a hunter. She's not part of any organisations that use mercury in rituals. What's valuable about her is her blood, because it's so corrupt. So, to me, Oedon's relationship with mercury is not that mercury is really, really valuable to him as a substance. It's that enough mercury in your blood starts making it impure. So Oedon, who's seeking out corrupted blood, sees that and says, well, it's better than nothing, and draws the impurity to the surface. So here is my provisional explanation for Oedon. Oedon just wants to reproduce, like the other Great Ones, because all his children have died. There is no great conspiracy. He is not secretly running the Healing Church, he is not the doll, he's not the player character, he's not the moon presence, he's just, as his runes explicitly tell you, a voice. In order for Oedon to reproduce, he needs corrupted blood, which acts as a medium for him to conceive his children. The conception also requires someone who can bear children. So what he's looking for is a woman of childbearing age whose blood is extremely corrupt. Because Yharnam blood is stagnating and beginning to breed vermin, it is verging on being corrupt enough for Oedon's purposes. So Oedon's poking around inside Yharnam blood, trying to find something that's sufficiently corrupt for him to use. Oedon is localized in a chapel in Cathedral Ward. His presence seems quite powerful, to the point where he has attracted the attention of this amygdala, and has sent various people mad. Because Oedon manifests as a voice, he appears in people's minds as a Caryll rune, Caryll runes being transcriptions of the Great One's voices. Because Oedon is localized in the chapel, he needs to have a woman with corrupted blood brought to his chapel in order for him to conceive. This ultimately happens as a result of the Oedon Chapel dweller, who is possibly being influenced subconsciously by Oedon, gathering all of Yharnam's survivors in Oedon Chapel. This ultimately includes Ariana, who carries the kind of tainted blood that Oedon needs. So when Rom dies and the Red Moon descends, Oedon is able to impregnate Ariana, who gives birth to Oedon's child. So there's an irony here, because you have Lawrence contacting the moon presence and that going horribly wrong. You've got the choir dredging up Ebrietas, but her not being able to provide offspring. And then you've got Mensis finding a giant useless brain and trying hopelessly to contact Kos. But the whole time, Oedon was right there in Cathedral Ward, and they just didn't notice.
LODS of OEDON. What's they spell? Loads of money!
People have suggested that the name Oedon is a reference to Oedipus, because Oedipus gouged out his eyes, and from this we get the word Oedipism, which is used to describe people who self-inflict wounds on their eyes. And this was quite a common idea before the Old Hunters came out, because we had a game that was full of characters whose eyes were bandaged and apparently damaged, and we had no explanation for why this was. So by bringing in Oedipism, we had a kind of explanation for what was going on, which was that these characters were going mad, which they clearly were, and mutilating their eyes. There was also an argument that Oedon could be a reference to Odin, the Norse god, because Odin sacrificed one of his eyes to gain knowledge. And the statue in Tomb of Oedon kind of looks like Odin, because it's a man with a large beard, and he's got what looks to be a missing eye. Now that we have the old hunters, though, we know that the missing eyes is to do with eyes rotting as a side effect of blood drunkenness. It's not a self-inflicted wound, it's a symptom of something else. So I think we need to re-examine the name Oedon, because Bloodborne does not actually have very many made-up words in it. It's things like amygdala, which is a real word, and then we have mensis and ebrietus, which have obvious Latin roots. And we've also got names like flora. So is there a real-world etymology for the name Oedon? Now, Oedon is written phonetically in Japanese like this. Now, read phonetically, that's not Oedon, it's Oedon. Now, in comparison, if you wanted to write the name Oedipus in Japanese, you'd write it like this, which would roughly be pronounced Oedipusu. So, if you look at the two side by side, the first syllable is written totally differently. In one case you have O, and in one case you have Oi. So if they had wanted the word Oedon to evoke Oedipus, they would have written it like something like this, Oedon. But it is written Odon. So what does Odon mean? Well, Odon is a name. And in some parts of the world it's actually quite a common name. But I want to focus specifically on Argentina. And a man called Jorge Oedon. Jorge Oedon is the inventor of an instrument called the Oedon device. Oedon devices are used to assist during difficult pregnancies. So immediately we kind of have a connection to Oedon, because his whole character is essentially defined by difficult births. Now, on its own, this might not be that convincing. However, let's look at the way an Oedon device works. The way an Oedon device works is it wraps itself around the head of the baby and then pulls the baby out of the vagina head first, like basically a big suction cup. So when the child comes out, its head is enveloped in this big plastic sheath. Now, Bloodborne doesn't have any plastic in it, but let's look at what else is on the top floor of Oedon Chapel. And even if that's a complete coincidence, I still like it.